Well, good morning, Spring Lake Village. It's good to see all of you again this Friday, the 18th of September, for our third installment on the life of remarkable female British explorers. Well, this week we explore the life of Freya Stark, sometimes known as the passionate nomad, the last of the great romantic explorers. During her long life, she lived to be 100 years of age. She traveled through the Near East and the Middle East and produced over 24 works in which she discusses her perilous trips through remote areas of that region of the world where few Europeans, particularly women, had traveled. So I think you'll enjoy our exploration in the remarkable life of Dame Freya Madeline Stark. So Freya was born in the Montmartre district of Paris in January of 1893. And as I mentioned, she would live to be 100, dying in 1993. Her parents, Robert Stark, was a painter, but he actually had studied sculpture, born in Devonshire. And he married his first cousin, Flora, born in Italy, who was trained also as a painter, but was also a rather accomplished pianist. Now, her father, again, Robert, was British, but her mother was of mixed extraction. She had some English, French, Polish, and German in her. So already her parents were sort of known as bohemians. They traveled between the moors of Devon, where Robert had grown up, and Italy, in particular, Oslo, Italy, which would become the home of Freya. Already when she was 2 years old, she and her younger sister, Vera, had been transported across the Alps by basket to Cortina d'Ampezzo. The parents did not have a good relationship. It was quite tempestuous. Flora enjoyed the warm climate of the Veneto region and absolutely detested the cold environment of the moors of Devonshire. We discover already that young Freya was very gifted in languages. Her parents spoke a number of languages at home, but Freya was particularly adept at picking up languages from an early age. So already by the age of 7, she spoke English, Italian, French, German, and by the age of 9, she was already teaching herself a little Latin and less Greek, as Shakespeare would say. But as I mentioned, her parents' relationship was rocky. They were fiery artists. And eventually, the parents would separate when Freya was only 11 years of age. She was very, very close with her mom. And in 1901, her mom moved to Oslo, which is located in the Veneto, the region that was controlled by Venice at the foothills of the Dolomites. And her father actually moved on to Canada. We know she read a lot as a young woman. She read a lot of the novels of Jane Austen, but in particular, she loved the works of Alexander Dumas. She had been presented by a relative with 1001 Nights that really began her lifelong love affair with the Middle East. We also know that as a young girl, and even throughout her life, she suffered from quite a few sicknesses and ailments, in particular pleurisy. She could have died of tuberculosis at a young age. And as we'll discover, she had some near death experiences during the course of her very long life. This is a map of the Veneto region. Here you see Venice over here, and Padua, and Asolo is located north of Padua, somewhere around here. Look at this inset map over here. You can see Asolo marked with the red star. So that became her home, along with her mother and her sister, and it's where she would return to, and where she eventually died in 1993. So when Freya was 13 years of age in 1906, her parents, of course, had separated. Her father, Robert, living in Canada. Her mother, Flora, moved her children from Asolo to Droniero, which is located to the west in the Piedmont region. And the reason she did this is she had fallen in love with a count by the name of Mario di Roascio, and she had invested in a carpet business. So she took the children to Droniero, and Count Mario was nearly 20 years younger than Flora. When the father caught wind of this, he ended he really severed the relationship. He didn't realize that his wife had used funds to engage in this enterprise with her lover. I mentioned that Freya had a number of near-death experiences, and one that took place at the carpet factory in Droniero could have resulted in her death. So both she and her sister at the time had hair that fell to their knee. So one day, while she was in the factory, her beautiful hair got caught in the meal mechanism, this great wheel, and it literally dragged her up nearly to the rooftop. And Mario, just in time, pulled her down. But in the process, half of her scalp was torn off. She lost her right ear and part of her part of her eyebrow, one of her eyebrows. She was nearly dead, and she was taken to a hospital for 4 months, where a young doctor did save her life, and he worked on her on a pioneering grafting technique. It was successful, but she felt marred for life. For hereafter, she would wear different hats, and actually, she became very famous for some of her more elaborate, over-the-top hats in her later life. But she was very self-conscious how she looked, and it really affected her self-esteem. And over the course of her life, she did have suitors, nearly got married. She would get married in her later life, but she felt like she was something of a freak as a result of this horrific accident that took place. So this was an extremely traumatic experience. Now, interestingly enough, the very overbearing, egotistical Count Mario, who began as the lover of her mother Flora, now his affections turned to Freya. He wanted to marry her despite her disfigurement, but she turned him down. She actually hated him. Eventually, he would marry her younger sister, Vera, who was very attractive. And the family felt sort of obligated by Mario in many ways. He was something of a Svengali. What you read about him is really unsavory, but he had some kind of pull on the women, and he did eventually marry Vera, who went on to bear him 6 children. But tragically, in 1926, she lost her life after giving birth to the sixth child. Now, I mentioned too that Freya was beset by a number of ailments, including pneumonia, pleurisy, etc. So, um, while taking care of her mother and her sister as a young woman, till Vera, of course, was married, she herself was beset by these ailments, and you could say she was somewhat bedridden for a good deal of that. Now, in 1918, when Vera was about 15 years of age, after what she regarded as years of drudgery as the bookkeeper for the carpet factory, Freya finally made her escape, and she traveled to London, where she would remain for a couple of years. And while there, she took some courses at the Bedford College in London, and she also trained to be a nurse, and served as a nurse during World War One, in Bologna. And also during that time, she set up a flower business where she was able to earn some money that she would eventually use to further her studies, and then make her first trip to the Middle East. She also was courted by a scientist, a bacteriologist by the name of Guido Ruata, who was about 20 years older than she. But eventually this engagement broke off because a woman that he had been in love with previously returned from America, and he broke off the engagement with Freya and married this woman. In 1916, she went back to Oslo, where she would spend the rest of her life. And during that time, there were at least 2 suitors that were in love with her, but both of them, she refused to get married to them. Again, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that she felt ugly as a result of her disfigurement, this horrible accident that had taken place when she was 13. So, more than anything else, Freya wanted to travel to the Middle East. That had been her lifelong ambition up to this point. And her father, before he had left for Canada, had left a small bequest to both Freya and her younger sister, Vera, and she had put that money aside, and also the money she had derived from her flower business. She used this money now to study Middle Eastern languages. And as I mentioned, she was very gifted at picking up languages. So she learned Arabic. She eventually learned to read the Quran in Arabic, and she also learned Persian, Farsi, at the famous London School of Oriental and African Studies, where many British diplomats had studied, many famous scholars of note had studied at this famed institute. So in November of 1927, about a year after her sister had died in 1926, Freya, 34 years of age, ventured off on her first trip to the Middle East, actually the Near East. You know, that term Near East is kind of fallen out of favor, but it used to be used often to refer to Anatolia or Turkey and the region called the Levant that included Syria, the Lebanon, and Palestine. Today, now Middle East sort of refers to the entire region of the Near East, North Africa, and further east. The other areas that make up the Middle East. In any case, she took off excited, and just 3 weeks later, we find her in French occupied Lebanon. Now, that region had been convulsed by a number of civil wars. So it was very dangerous territory, and it was also the region of the Druze, that very interesting secular sect, not secular, but a sect of Shia Islam. We discussed them when we talked about Lady Hester Stanhope, who had also resided in Druze territory, in the Jabal Druze territory. And now she, using her broken Arabic, she was not yet that proficient, but her Arabic would become better and better as the years continued. But she did not want to present herself as one of these typical wives of British officials, but rather as a student. She very much liked to congregate among the locals. And this is borne out in her many writings. This was one of her great gifts, of really being able to um, engage with local population, learn local customs, be on very good terms with Bedouin and other interesting tribes people of these regions. And she endeared herself to these individuals. And it did help that she was a woman, a single woman as well. She was able to establish very, very close ties. Again, she wasn't like the typical British woman who was involved in the sort of social activities we associate with British expatriates, like going to, outdoor fetes or tea parties, etc., that we associate with colonialists in the Middle East. And she also, much to the consternation of a lot of the British, she liked to sort of go off on her own. We do find her sort of exploring the region alone, although occasionally she would hire the services of a local, like a Druze in the Jabal Druze region. Eventually, she moved to Damascus, the capital of Syria, where she took more Arabic lessons. And while there, she met a friend by the name of Venetia Budakam, and together the two would make their way to the great ancient city of Baalbek by car. Now, Baalbek sadly was heavily damaged by ISIS just a few years ago. They also ventured off to Druze territory once again. As I mentioned, very dangerous. There had been a very serious civil war, so they were very much discouraged from traveling in this region, but nonetheless, they did, with the aid of a Druze guide by the name of Najem, who eventually escorted them to Palestine, which at the time was under British mandate. Here's a colored engraving from the 19th century of the famous temple of Baal or Bel at Baalbek. So after 5 months, she returned to London, having written letters that were eventually published as Letters from Syria, that actually didn't go to print until 1942. Now, this account of Freya's first journey east of Italy and her first contact with the Near East has kind of a simple touristic quality in her observations. And this publication lacks most of the philosophical reflections that would characterize her more polished works. As I mentioned, she would go on to publish more than 24 works. So, for example, her first impression of the ancient city of Antioch was of, quote, a population all suffering from toothache and nothing like the dignified turban of the Arabian Nights. But it is the Arabian Nights all the same. So back in London, she continued her studies in Arabic and in Farsi, but she also learned cartography and drawing because she wanted to be able to create her own maps during her subsequent explorations of the Near and Middle East. And at this time, everything changed when Freya had returned back to London. She had received a letter from the Royal Geographic Society. They would give her a prize for her journeys, and that would sort of give her some money to pursue her exploration of this region. So we find her now making her way back to the Middle East, and she traveled to Baghdad, where she would continue her studies of Persian. And while in Baghdad, she mingled with a lot of the expats, the wives and the diplomats who were stationed there in Baghdad. But in addition, she also made excursions on her own among the Bedouins of the region, although she was usually accompanied by Iraqi nationals, which was considered sort of verboten, the idea of intermingling with Iraqi nationals was frowned upon. One of her most important journeys during this second tour of the Middle East was to the famed region located between Iraq and Iran, the famous region of Luristan, Luristan, in Arabic known as Al-Khawaz. Now, she crossed over into this region illegally. She didn't have any official documents to this region, and many Europeans were barred. Archaeologists had discovered a number of beautiful bronzes and gold statuary, the famed Luristan treasures. Many of them had been looted. This region, this ancient people who lived in Luristan during the classical age were famed as metallurgists. And she herself was sort of in search of some of these treasures, and she did come across some sites, grave sites that she assumed were of Luristani origin, but in fact they were Muslim graves. And while on site, she was arrested by local police and taken to the regional capital of Husainabad. Now, once she and her other guides were apprehended, the governor was somewhat bemused by her that he had sort of captured an English woman who somehow, amazingly, had survived the elements and had not been attacked by highwaymen, because a lot of foreigners had been. Um, and way back in the capital of Iran, Tehran, she had learned, well, eventually she was released, and back in Tehran, she learned that, she was actually very fortunate, that she hadn't been murdered in search of treasures in Luristan as others before her had. So this was an area that few Europeans were felt comfortable traveling in, let alone a woman. But it's one of her most famous expeditions that she would recount in a couple of her. Now, I found a few maps showing the Luristan region. So here you can see in purple Luristan. Again, it's located between Iran and present day Iraq. This is a map of sort of ancient kingdoms dating, oh boy, some 2.5 millennia ago. The kingdom of Elam, Mesopotamia, Assur. So Luristan actually dates back, nearly 26 centuries. Here's a map during her travels in the 1930s. So this region here, the Al Hawaz region. Here's this is the Persian Gulf here. But anyway, this gives you an idea of the location of Luristan. So I should mention, Freya was the first European woman to venture to Luristan. One of her biographers writes of her perilous journey here. Enduring hunger, gale winds, nights on rocky terrain, and a guide who appropriated her Burberry coat. I should mention she often wore, sort of expensive British clothing. And this guy fell to praying when dinner had to be obtained. Freya encountered dervishes, idol worshippers, and armed tribesmen, attended weddings and dyings, and attempted to scamper with an ibex on the side of a 9,000-foot mountain. In 1931, she went on one of her most celebrated journeys to northern Iran in the Elburz Mountains, to the famous valleys of the assassins in the Alamut Valley. She wanted to see the region where the famed assassins of fame were located. The assassins were fanatical followers of a sect belonging to the Shiite Islam, who used religious reasons to justify killing their enemies. They flourished during the 11th century, and they built a string of fortifications, of castle strongholds. In fact, they were part of a sect called the Nizari Ishmaeli, again, part of the Shia sect. And, they were involved in a number of killings. Eventually, they were overwhelmed by the Mongol hordes in the 13th century. Now, their name, official name, was Hashashun, from which we get the word hashish, which they smoked, and from this, in French, we get the word for assassin. And this remarkable journey through the legendary Alamut, or the Valley of the Assassins, was published 3 years after this epic journey, 1934, in the Valleys of the Assassins, which is one of the most entertaining and most engaging books. This would be one of the books I would recommend. I have a copy that's all worn. I remember reading it on some of my excavations in the Northern Galilee. Probably should get a new copy. It's pretty worn. But for this book, she was awarded by the Royal Geographic Society, because it really does present a really remarkable ethnographic study of the people. It's highly readable. Just her use of language uh, is um, is second to none in way of travel writing, and also you can see the love she had for the people. Very sympathetic portrait that she paints of the people of this region. This is a nice black and white photograph of Freya traveling in the Valley of the Assassins. Oops. Hold on here. I think I had a little technical glitch there. Um, Here is a color photo of the Valley of the Assassins. You can see how rugged it is. But most of them aren't well preserved, but as I mentioned, there were a series of fortifications that were constructed by the inhabitants of this region. This is the most famous of the strongholds preserved. It's been restored. It is a World Heritage Site, but this is one of the ruins that she visited. She also visited the Kurds in Kurdistan, who, of course, even way back in the 1930s, wanted their own country, still not realized nearly 100 years later. But this is a great photograph. She's actually not in this photograph, but this is a picture of the Kurds that was taken. This is a map of the region. So here you can see the Valley of the Assassins, or Alamut, at 4,175 meters. And then where you see these black squares, these are all what remains. These are various castles that were constructed in the Valley of the Assassins. So few explorers at this time had such an ability to be able to communicate with the locals of the region. And time again, she was able to extricate herself from what could have been a very dangerous situation. As I mentioned, she liked traveling alone often as she could, but she did from time to time hire like a local Bedouin, for example. And she, of course, never wanted to present herself as some well-heeled European woman. So the age-old tradition of hospitality, she would find herself often in harems or being hosted by local tribes people. um, like in southern Arabia or in the region of the Druze. She was very much aware of how Europeans, colonialists, could be very imperious, look down upon local populations. So she was known to uh, be very kind and respectful of local traditions. And in this way, she was able really to forge very strong bonds with the local population. So we find her not only associating and establishing good ties with women as she stayed in harems, but also maintain very good ties with Arabic men, which in uh, Islamic culture is not very commonplace. There was sort of this division between men and women, but here we find her very much fraternizing with Arabic men. And once, when she was asked, "Aren't you afraid traveling alone, especially as a woman?" And she said, "No, really, in the end, I was sincerely out for knowledge." She had this insatiable thirst to learn everything about this region. And so for her, the just the sheer joy of learning new things in these remote areas just really motivated her, pushed her to continue her explorations. Here's a couple of great photographs of her here. You see her with a parasol. She's having a picnic lunch. And then down here, you see her in a plain of Iraq. In the distance, I believe, are the ruins of a shore in the distance, but you see her almost like a, upper class British woman enjoying a respite with a man and another woman, not identified. I should mention too that the harem, was for Freya a means of gaining trust and approaching the powerful men who were the primary subjects of her visit. But her feeling for feminine rights and habits, and particularly wardrobes, was unfeigned. She once wrote, "There are few sorrows through which a new dress or hat will not send a little gleam of hope, however fugitive." In 1934, she sailed down the Red Sea to southern Arabia to Aden in the Yemen. She had wanted to retrace the famous frankincense route to the hinterland of Yemen in the famed Hadramaut region in southern Arabia. Now, this region had rarely been explored by Western explorers, males, and women unheard of. So she really did become celebrated as the first woman of European descent to explore the Hadramaut region. She was in search of the famed capital of the Queen of Sheba of biblical fame, she who had visited King Solomon. And while traveling in this region, she came down with measles and dysentery. Again, I mentioned she was prone to illnesses throughout her life. She actually never found Shabwa, but what she did encounter was slavery. So for her, the persistence of slavery posed for her a moral predicament for someone who wished to avoid any intimation of cultural advantage. And for her, coming to grips with the fact that slavery still existed, um, even in this remote region, in her mind, she believed that slavery eventually would fade away as this region would embrace or more lofty ideas about egalitarianism, and eventually that slavery would be in decline, but actually it would take a number of generations before slavery would be eradicated in the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, sadly, there are still pockets of slavery that still exist in southern Arabia even today. So the Middle East, especially the Arabian Peninsula, was still a formidably religious society, but it was changing fast, in her mind, too fast, owing to the interference of foreigners like herself. When asked by a Bedouin in the Hadramaut region around a campfire if she was indeed one of those foreigners who had come, quote, to make us free our slaves and pay taxes and make our women do as they please, Freya replied with an evasive joke, saying that she didn't know about the first two, quote, but I know that your women do as they please already. The accounts of her journey in this region was published in 1936. Again, one that received a lot of plaudits. The Southern Gates of Arabia, a journey in the Hadramaut. So here are a couple of maps. On the right-hand side, you can see Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, the capital. Here, Mecca. And then if you go all the way to the south in the Yemen here, you see the capital of Sana'a. Of course, this region now is racked by civil war, as you know. And Aden down here. So here's Aden, and here's the Hadramaut. This is the famous region famed for frankincense from time immemorial. Here's Sana'a. Here's a great photograph that she took of the ancient square in the Hadramaut. You know, look at this mud brick architecture, these towers. This is typical Yemeni architecture that you also see in Sana'a, which a World Heritage Site, but sadly, a lot of this architecture has been destroyed now during the last civil years of strife in this region. Here's a photograph from her publication showing some of the local Bedouin locals in the Hadramaut region. Here's Freya on horseback with a couple of guides. In 1939, as war was threatening, Freya offered her services to the British government and was assigned to the Middle East propaganda section of the Ministry of Information. She was by then quite an illustrious personage among the British expatriates in the Middle East, yet had maintained an identity apart. She had published one of her books, Baghdad Sketches, making light of the complacent British community there. But she was called upon by the British government to use her knowledge of Arab. Now she was extremely proficient in a number of Arabic dialects, especially of this region. And she used her knowledge also of local customs to an advantage to counter Nazi propaganda in this region of the world. And from Aden in the Yemen, she would make a number of radio broadcasts, which were broadcast in Arabic. And she also produced a number of films in order to gain sympathy from the local population who would not be influenced by Nazi propaganda. She wanted to get the local population to side with the British, and she was very successful. She really endeared herself with the Yemeni population. These films, these propaganda films, were extremely well produced, and she successfully accomplished the goal of countering Nazi propaganda. Another one of her contributions during this period too was establishing a organization to counter the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, you've probably heard of. It had its origins were in Egypt. It was very pro-Nazi at the time, and it was very, very much anti-British. And in order to counter the Muslim Brotherhood, the British, with the help of Freya, created the so-called Brotherhood of Freedom. And now we have Arab and Egyptians, some 40,000 strong, who would support the British cause and serve as a counterweight to the Muslim Brotherhood. This organization very much espoused the ideals of secular democracy, freedom, etc. And in order to champion these noble and lofty ideals, she went on lecture tours. Um, Again, she used the radio medium, but she also went to tea parties where women were gathered, other kind of social events, in order to promote the work of the Brotherhood of Freedom, in order to enlist new members. Again, it had over 40,000 members, became part of the Brotherhood of Freedom. But she did get into some trouble regarding her stance on the establishment of an Israeli state. So going all the way back to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which had called for the eventual creation of a Jewish state within Palestine, we now find the British turning no longer supporting the idea of an Israeli state. Instead, we find backtracking on this, and the real reason for this was the British and the European and their other allies were very much in need of a constant supply of oil from the newly discovered oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula. So they did not in any way want to create enemies among the Arabs. She had gone on a number of speeches, especially in the United States, in order to explain her position and that of the British, but she got labeled as an anti-Semite or a Judeophobe. And this was sort of a low point in her period. But she is now already hailed as the female Lawrence of Arabia, like her contemporary Gertrude Bell, whom we'll discuss in our last lecture next week. So at the end of World War II in 1945, we find Freya returning to her beloved Oslo, and she took up residence in a villa that she had inherited from a friend. And she finally did marry in 1947 to a British civil servant by the name of Stuart Perrone, but the marriage didn't last. The two eventually did separate. I don't think they officially divorced. She within a short time sort of grew weary of being the wife of a civil servant, but mostly the marriage was what they call a mariage blanc. It was never consummated because it was pretty much known within her circle that Sue was homosexual. So they kind of went their separate ways. And in Oslo, she became very famous over the next several years of holding very elaborate parties in which she would wear beautiful European French gowns, but she was mostly known for her very elaborate, sort of over the top hats. Here you see her in her 75th year wearing an expensive red hat. Um, and she was continuing to learn languages for further trips in the Middle East. So already in the 1950s now, she's about 60 years of age. She's learning Turkish. She also received a special honorary degree from the University of Glasgow. But Turkish for another great expedition to Anatolia, especially to southern Turkey. It would result in 4 books, including one on the travels of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, his famous journey through Lycia and along the coastline of Turkey. She would retrace in a book discussing his accounts. Her last important trip was to Afghanistan. She began in Kabul. About 10 years earlier, about 1957-58, a RAF pilot had discovered a minaret, the famous minaret of Jam. And this is what she explored when she took a journey from Kabul to Jam. And this journey is recounted in the book, The Minaret of Jam. One of her last great travel accounts. In 1972, she was awarded the DBE, rightfully, as Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. She remained very, very, very active in her twilight years. She didn't give up her driver's license until she was 85, but she continued to ride on horseback. As I mentioned, she published about 25 books, and she died at the ripe old age of 100, about 5 months after her 100th birthday. So not Freda Kahlo, sorry, Freya Stark will go down in the annals of exploration to the Middle East as one of the giants. In her 25 famous accounts, she paints such vivid portraits of the people she met, of their customs, of the many places she visited, again, where few women, if not any women, had ever ventured to. And she remains one of the greatest of the female explorers of this period. So next week, we'll wrap it up with Gertrude Bell. Now, I know we did have a discussion of Miss Bell a few years back, but she's so famous and so important were her contributions that I thought we would revisit her as we wrap up our lecture series on famous female British explorers. So look forward to seeing you next week, and do take care of yourself. Bye for now.